Good morning. I'm Jonathan Knopf, the Executive Director for Programs for Housing Forward Virginia. It is our privilege to be here again, partially opening up this year's Governor's Housing Conference for 2022. For those of you who are familiar with Housing Forward and who have been at housing conferences in the past, we've always been lucky enough to do something like this each year and dig into a particular topic or thing that we can spend a little bit more time chewing on than maybe what we can in a snap session or one of the hour-and-a-half sessions later on in the conference. And so we've done this for rural housing needs, we've done this for overcoming NIMBY, we've done this for post-COVID collaboration, all sorts of stuff that we've really tried to peel away the layers on the onion for. And so today we're going to talk about zoning, and we're going to talk about being zoned out. So what are we zoned out from? We're zoned out of affordability. We're zoned out of sustainability, we're zoned out of opportunity, and a lot of times we're just zoned out of happiness. Our zoning code is just not making us happy in most cases. And it makes our job, especially our job as people who try to provide affordable housing, build affordable housing, create more affordable housing opportunities, it makes our job really tough. And so thankfully, I'm joined today by 5 excellent speakers and 1 great moderator who are all experts and innovators in their field. We're going to hear about the problems they see in their work and what they would do if they were in charge of the world any given day. So we're really looking forward to their presentations. The format for today is we'll do some quick presentations at the beginning. They're going to do some show and tell about some really interesting things that they've been working on or thinking about to kickstart the conversation. And then the second half of today will be Q&A. And so we want that to be interactive with the audience. And so to facilitate kind of a fair process and not have us kind of worming our way around and trying to pass a microphone around, please sign in if you haven't already. Pull up the QR code. You can also visit housingforwardva.org/zoned-out. Just give us your name and email, and you're welcome to submit questions that way. They will go straight to Sharnita. And so that should be a pretty seamless process, but we will address any tech issues as they may arise, because they always do. So without any further ado, thank you all again for being here, and I will pass it off to Sharnita Bethay from the Hampton Roads Planning District Commission and Superstar Housing Forward Board member as well. So, Sharnita,
I love it.
Thanks, Jonathan. Superstar newbie, so I'm new to the board a couple of months, but have always enjoyed working with Housing Board Virginia and excited to be here. I think we should give ourselves a round of applause. This is our first in-person fully conference in 2 years. We're just glad to be here. I see a lot of new faces. I see a lot of old colleagues, seasoned colleagues, I would say, in terms of this. And I'm just excited that this room is packed. I know when I first started out in housing, whenever you said the word zoning, it's that mystical room in the side that these decisions are made and you never talk to them, you never collaborate with them. It was a whole separate department. And what we're finding out when we're looking at housing and all the work that we do in our communities, if we don't have our zoning as a partner in this process, then all of the initiatives and all of the programs that we have, we will not succeed. So I think that you all showing the interest of being here makes all the matters. How many have worked in the area of zoning or have ever had to confer with zoning? Yeah. So that right there is the problem, that not all hands are up. So that means that we're all utilizing the cities and the programs that we have. So we're excited today to be here to talk about zoning, to talk about some of the innovative things that our presenters are going to share with you today. It's a topic that's sometimes taboo because we don't want to really address the fact that a lot of the zoning laws and a lot of the ordinances that we see in localities were put there to place people out of communities. And we're only talking about the snapshot of housing, but if you look at what housing does, it provides access to health, it provides access to better education opportunities, access to transit and employment. So as you all journey through your housing experiences today, and when you go back to your office next week and start thinking about how you can be an impact, make sure that you're bringing other people along in this process that may not necessarily be housers. So we're excited. We want to get started. We have a lot of information to share with you all. And we want to start with some brief introductions with Eleanor. And we're going to just go down the line and they're going to do a brief introduction of them. And then we'll take it from there. Eleanor?
Hi, good morning, everybody. It is so nice to see a packed room. I'm shocked, but pleasantly so. So my name is Dr. Eleanor Vincent. The doctor is not in zoning, so don't get your hopes too high. I'm the Chief Operating Officer at Pathway Homes, Inc. We are the largest provider of permanent supportive housing in the Northern Virginia area, a primary population, adults with serious mental illnesses, co-occurring disorders, and other disabilities. I've worked in this area for over 19 years with Pathway Homes. We provide those services in Northern Virginia, so most of the counties there, as well as Washington, D.C., and also in Central Florida. And we're very familiar with the zoning challenges, so I look forward to having this conversation with you this morning, and thanks for having me.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Jim Russell. I'm a freelance geographer, and I mainly work in like Rust Belt cities, dealing with distressed neighborhoods that are trying to find a new economic purpose. It's very unlike what I deal with now. I'm chair of the Loudoun County Housing Advisory Board. I'm also chair of the board for Habitat for Humanity in Loudoun, and newly elected chair of the Virginia Statewide Community Land Trust. A lot of what I deal with in Loudoun is very different than what I dealt with in, say, Cleveland and Pittsburgh. But before that, I was a planning and zoning commissioner in Longmont, Colorado. And that housing market, very, very similar. We were dealing with a lot of people displaced from Boulder. Longmont's about 11 miles outside of Boulder. And the lowest housing prices in all of Boulder County were always in Longmont, which posed an interesting question as to why. But people eventually would figure that out, and then there was a rush to get into the housing there, and people were being priced out of the community. So what I've seen there, I see a lot here. Thank you.
Oh, there we go. Hi, I am Hannah Sabo, and I'm a zoning administrator for the city of Virginia Beach. I've been in local government for about 9 years. I was a zoning administrator in the city of Hampton before that, both, of course, dealing with housing issues. Virginia Beach being a resort area, we have some different issues than we did in Hampton, but I'm really excited to be here and talk about zoning.
Hi, Maritza Mercado Peachin. I work for the City of Richmond, where I'm the Deputy Director for Equitable Development, and I'll talk more about what that means in my presentation. I've worked for the city for about 2 years, and prior to that, I was an embedded consultant working for AECOM, developing the city's master plan. I worked for AECOM prior to that for 5.5 years, and I also worked for a local developer in Richmond, helping her do mixed-use infill redevelopment. And funny enough, when I was starting the master plan, I read lots and lots of master plans from across the country, like just to see what the current vanguard was of planning. And somehow I came across Longmont, Colorado's master plan. And it ended up being a major reference point for me because it was just very well done the way they organized it. And I've never met anyone from Longmont. I just perused all of their materials online and saved them on my server.
That's good to hear.
Yeah.
Good morning. I'm Jody Dubiaski. I'm the owner and principal architect at Form Coalition, which is based in Richmond. Our work focuses on helping people build vibrant, healthy neighborhoods. So most of our work is small infill, mixed use, and commercial, and then we also collaborate on master plans and urban design with larger housing elements, things like that.
Great. So as you can see, we have a very diverse panelist today, and also geographical. So the other homework I'm going to give you today is to reach out to either these people or your other colleagues that you see, because that's how we build communities, is collaborative work. And these Governor Housing Conference have allowed me to meet partners even in different areas. I'm in the Hampton Roads area. I'm from Southwest Virginia in the South Boston, Halifax area. But I hear woo. Is that woo? Woo. You don't hear too many woos about Halifax. I'll take it. But what is another Halifax? Okay, we rule. Anyway, what has been instrumental for me is partnerships and collaboration. And I always tell people I don't know, but I can find out. So let this next couple of days be your ability to, what I say, groom your toolbox of those things that you need to take back. And sometimes it's huge, there's huge endeavors, but when you're pinging on your other collaborative partners in your area or across the state, or as they were mentioning, saving all those documents, it helps us out. So we're going to get started, and what we're going to do now is have a brief presentation from all of our panelists first. So please hold your questions. There's a QR code there that we're going to be populating those questions after all of our presentations are done, and we'll start from that piece. So we're going to kick it off with Eleanor.
Awesome. Do I have a PowerPoint? Do we? Thank you. Thank you so much. I'm actually going to stand. So during the day, I'm a chief operating officer. In the evenings, I work in my own private psychotherapy practice. That's what my doctorate is in. So I'm standing up so I can see all of you. So eye contact is really important to me. Thank you. I'm also, okay, let me make sure I know which way I'm going. I'm also, there you go, susceptible to nonverbal cues, so I want to make sure that I'm scanning and seeing that. So this is Pathway Homes. Briefly, this is who we are. I think our mission actually captures our commitment and investment in affordable housing, and it's usually the people we're talking about are people at the bottom of the barrel. There's no better way to say it. So part of this presentation is asking the question, affordable for whom? When we talk about affordable housing, what does that mean? I have 10 minutes to get through this. So what we do, we currently have this many units where we provide housing and services to individuals. We own about 130 of those units, and we do all of these services that you're seeing. We also have 2 assisted living facilities in Fairfax County. We don't have enough of those. Zoning impacts the ability to do that kind of startup, but we're working on it. And again, the population we serve, these are individuals for the most part who are 30% and below annual median income, average median income, AMI, which means they're earning about less than $800 a month. If you just stick with Fairfax County, usually when we're looking for housing for folks, it's using the HUD FMR, which currently is about $1,615, I think, for a 1-bedroom. In Fairfax County, $1,800, $1,900 is what you would get for a 1-bedroom. Even places like Route 1 in Alexandria, where we used to find cheaper units, you can't find one now these days at less than $1,800, $1,900 a month. And one of the things that we see happening is that we're having developers come in, they're buying up these, communities, renovating them, doing all kinds of things, and then the rent becomes $2,000 plus a month. So even with all the subsidies that you can get, we just can't compete. And people are being zoned out of homes, zoned out of affordability, zoned out of happiness, zoned out of health. We know that housing is one of the social determinants of health, which means it's one of those things that impacts how healthy you are. Where you live has impact on every single thing. It impacts which schools your kids get access, with jobs sometimes that you can, what kinds of food you're eating, how much you pay for that food, who your neighbors are, how safe you feel, and so on and so forth. So in terms of the need, I mean, we don't even have to have a discussion about the need. These numbers are taken from Fairfax County point in time for the past, 5 years or so. You can see where the numbers are going. The last one, so the point in time count, if you know, is done in January, and it's about homeless people one day, so it's a point in time. That 1191 number for 2022, about 600 of those people were single adults that were homeless on that night in January. About 30% of that number, 33% to be exact, are adults with serious mental illnesses. So these are the people I was talking about before, who are literally homeless, live in Fairfax County, and really have nowhere to go. In DC, that number is like 4,100, I think, for 2022. So the good news is that we have legislative actions that are calling for action, and there's some really good things that are happening. The chairman of the Board of Supervisors in Fairfax County is an ally in affordable housing. And recently, the Board of Supervisors put a call to action, and they doubled their proposed development of affordable units by 100%. So from 5,000 units to 10,000 units. The other thing that's happening that is helpful is that places like the city of Fairfax is looking at zoning modification. So Fairfax County, the last time they revised their zoning laws was in 1978, right? A lot has happened since 1978. But we're making strides, so they have, and some of the things that they've done was, for example, to remove the requirement to have a public hearing if you wanted to add new accessory dwelling units. Because before you had to go through the administrative process and then you had to have a public hearing, which sometimes those can be quite fun, as we all know. So that's one good thing that's happening. The other thing is that, for example, the city of Fairfax is partnering with the Department of Housing and Community Services to manage this new approach that is working, which is called inclusionary zoning. A lot of communities are working on inclusionary zoning, which is that mixed use approach. So looking at having set-asides as we have new developments come in, having a 10%, 20%. In Fairfax, it's a 20% set aside for families that are in that band of like 30% and below. So there are things happening. I mean, I wouldn't want to stand here and say, you know what, it's all doom and gloom. Nothing is ever that way. That's just extreme. Life is not about extremes. There's usually somewhere in the middle that we land. So it's promising. Also, the state of Virginia just recently became the third state to actually codify into law the requirements that the state will no longer be allowed to deny building permits to projects. And I'm going to read this because historically this is what was happening. That projects were being denied permits because the housing development contained or was expected to contain affordable housing units occupied or intended for occupancy by families or individuals with income at or below 80% of the AMI. That was a pretty high bar to start with. I mean, that's not even touching the people that I started off talking about. But good news is now we have it in law, right? It's codified thanks to Delegate Jeff Bourne of Richmond. Richmond in the house. You guys are doing great things. And it's amazing to me that we've needed to be in 2022, needed to have a law passed to say, listen, as you're building all these, really good, universally appropriate green buildings, we need to have a law to enforce the expectation that people, certain types of people, can live there. So in the work that we do, and we are an anti-racist agency, I want to say that. We're very committed to, diversity, equity, inclusion, and justice. And we actually see zoning as the new redlining because it's the way that people are being kept out of places. And again, for the folks that we serve, they actually stand no chance if they don't have people like us advocating for them. NIMBYism, somebody talked about it, not in my backyard. Can you move the slide for me, please? I'm sorry, got stuck on the slide. Oh, I have the slide, I'm sorry. We were partnering, she was gonna help me, and then I took it away. So for us, these are the things that we land on. So because, for example, NIMBYism is one of the things that we've had to deal with. I mean, we started out in Fairfax in 1980 with one townhouse and a group of family members. And we're still having the same conversations in these communities. Every time we've had to open or lease up or, build a new building, we have questions coming at us. Who are the people who are going to be living here? Why are they coming in here? we are challenged, especially challenged in certain areas of the county, northern parts of the county, and over population in the southern parts of the county, so the one area. And so part of our advocacy is around, well, not in your backyard, but whose backyard should it be? And also, would that be different if this was your son or daughter? Because this person has a right. We believe housing is a right. It's not a privilege. And so our advocacy covers that. So we're constantly talking to folks locally, talking to folks down in Richmond. I'm a member of the Fairfax County Affordable Housing Advisory Committee and recently co-chaired the Homelessness Committee. And I see Michelle Crocker over there, who's a huge advocate and a friend of ours, tireless in advocating for some of the things that I'm talking about. So here's the other thing that we haven't done that well in this area that other people have done. When you say single room occupancy, SROs, some people faint. You know, it's like a bad word. It's a 3-letter bad word, single room occupancy, SROs. Well, there are places where this has worked. I mean, I worked in Massachusetts, in Boston, for many, many years before I moved to this area, and SROs have been used successfully, especially for the people that we're talking about. People are not at 50% AMI. They're not at 80% AMI. These are people who could not afford to rent a place without some of the subsidies that they have. But in Virginia, in Fairfax, I know that has been, we've looked at it over and over and over, and we always come to the same place. The Lawton Workhouse, if people know that, it used to be a prison. At some point, we engaged in discussions about potentially using the SRO model on that. That never went anywhere. We've come full circle. We're now talking about what to do with it. And I think we're talking about artistic community, like an arts community, and some high, I've got 2 minutes. I'm gonna wrap it up real quick. But so I could talk about this all day, but I don't have the time. Couple of other things that I wanna just touch on. So even with the changes in the legislative action that's happened in terms of accessory living units, which are units that maybe your basement, somebody can rent it, or maybe you convert a room, there's still some limitations that make it hard. So you have to think about parking. There's a formula where you have to have so many parking spaces allocated to you. It does not apply if it's not a single family home. And a few other things that makes it so that it's not always easy to use. One of the things that we're doing as a nonprofit that you would probably not think about nonprofits doing is that third thing, which is development of housing. The reason why we own 130 units is because when we own those units, all of these requirements and housing barriers that are thrown in front of people, we can control. And so we're able to house the people that we know need the housing. We're also developing some really neat partnerships with developers, because there are a lot of LIHTC, low housing income tax credits that are out there. The only way to do it is to buddy up with a developer, because the terms are extremely exclusionary for nonprofits like us. If you've not done it before, you don't have enough credits to actually be in the running to do it. And we're currently, actually, we have another presentation right now with the state. We're looking at developing up to 120 units. That's a $55 million project. And so it's about looking at, you know, letting the developers work with the zoning problems, duke that out. We're talking to HCD right at the outset, so we know, listen, are there any land use things that we should be looking at that's gonna make this impossible? We have to work with investors to get the money, and maybe faith-based communities. But one of our biggest takeaways is that free land, free land is not free. It comes with strings. And also the other thing that, you know, we've recognized is that without those subsidies that communities have, so project-based subsidies or housing subsidies, even this would not work, because the math just does not add up. And as much as we would have loved to do something for 100%, for 30% and below, you can't do it. It's not affordable. So what's the formula? It's what DC is doing, what they're doing in Europe. It's identifying social housing as affordable for the people 30% and below. So we should stop calling it affordable. Let's just call it social housing. That's the band. Affordable housing is market rate, so it's 50% and above. Then you can say it's affordable. But even our teachers and teachers, firefighters, policemen cannot afford to live in some parts of Fairfax County, for example, because it's not affordable. And I got my sign. It's time for me to go, but I'll be here if you have questions. So much we can talk about. Thank you so much for your time, and it's great. Thank you.
Thank you.
You need a clicker. I'm hugging the clicker.
That's okay. I had to give it away because I used the clicker. So. All right. I usually start with explaining a little bit what it means to be a geographer, because often, like in Thanksgiving, and I see relatives I haven't seen in a while, and they'll ask me, "So what do you do?" And when I say freelance geographer, I get a lot of quizzical looks, and then someone invariably says, "Oh, you study rocks." Well, in a roundabout way, maybe, but no. And then someone will start quizzing me about world capitals and things like that. Geography is particularly useful for understanding zoning because zoning is fundamentally flawed because it focuses on a single jurisdiction. And geographers, what they really look at is how two or more places are connected. And so I mentioned the Longmont situation. One thing is understanding that for whatever reason, the most inexpensive housing was in Longmont in Boulder County. But you couldn't solve any housing issue in Longmont without understanding what's going on in Boulder and their zoning, and what's going on in California, particularly as it relates to Proposition 13 and property taxes. Because you get, from places like California and Boulder, is a lot like, for Loudoun County, Arlington, and Fairfax. You have people with lots of equity moving in who have more resources available to them than the tenured residents. So we have to think about how those places are connected. And when we do a comprehensive plan and we do zoning ordinances, we do not look at what's going on in other jurisdictions. We do not understand the forces that are at play that are impacting our communities. Now, there are a lot of things within the community certainly are important, and often those are the things we grapple with. But just to get a quick idea is in these jurisdictions that decide zoning, you're better off doing your political battles at going up geographic scales. So at the state level, we have more of a problem here because we have multiple states and entities that we have to deal with. But so there's going to be two main points here on what's impacting our inability to zone correctly for the kinds of housing problems that we have. And one is the temporal issue. So we have, in time, it's hard to do a comprehensive plan. It's hard to decide what sort of zoning ordinances you're going to have. And there's this back and forth going on within that jurisdiction about issues that are important to various residents and businesses. But there's a lot of shocks to the housing market that are really short time frames, and things can completely change in the span of a few years. And so our regime of zoning is completely inadequate to deal with that. And that's why it's helpful to deal upscale, and I'll come up, I'll end with a couple more suggestions of how one might deal with that given the mismatch. So what we're looking at here is this theory about peak millennial. And this is housing demographer Dow Myers. And he's at University of Southern California. And I became aware of his work because he does a really good job of connecting places. So, he's not going to look at a neighborhood. He's going to look at how a neighborhood relates to the other neighborhoods in the area. And he does this through demographic analysis. And on the left-hand side, you've got the temporal change. So we're going to just crudely define the millennial generation as born in 1980, so anyone born up to 1999. And the idea of peak millennial is that in 1990, the most millennials were born. So you go forward 25 years, and you get to 2015. That is the magic number. So always remember 2015. In the United States in 2015, everything changed. And I'll prove it to you with the right-hand part of this slide. So what's going on the left hand is you're looking at age 25. So each year, the percentage increase or decrease of the population that is age 25. So you see in 2005, that's when the first millennials, born 1980, came of age, 25. Well, why 25? Why do we care? So 25 through 34 is the most geographically mobile, a cohort, age cohort. And then it goes down, 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 and then starts to come back up about the cohort of 55 through 64, so retirement migrations. And the part of it that's life cycle migration is across generations for 100 plus years. It's very stable, and we see the same thing in other wealthy countries, is that 25 through 34-year-olds like urban environments. So there is this idea that millennials love cities more than ever, and Dow Myers is like, not really. What we have is just more people of the age when people are in big cities. And that's what you're looking at. And in a lot of our zoning now, so anyone involved in doing a comprehensive plan or zoning ordinances post-2005 has been obsessed with urban housing and how do we make it more affordable. And one of the reasons why it was so unaffordable was because you see before then, the population of 25-year-olds was shrinking every year. And so we were reacting to that and building housing and saying, well, we don't need a lot, without saying, reading the handwriting on the wall, that a lot of people were coming. And the whole idea of peak millennial is that 1990 cohort, that you get past there, the birth group goes down, down, down. And so what's going to happen? We're going to see decreasing demand for large city environments. And what happens after 25 through 34 is 35 through 44, multiple people housing formation. And typically you see the move from city to suburb. And since we've been focused on building for the millennial cohort, we've ignored all the issues at the other side of saying, where are they going to move to? How are they going to have larger families? And so as people were looking to move out, they're looking for affordable places. Now, what's interesting on the right hand is it's a bit of a mystery because it's by major metro, that's to the left. The middle one is other metros, and then there's non-metros, so more or less rural areas. And what you see, so it, again, goes like each year. You get to about 2015, the domestic migration flips from positive to large metros to negative and gets increasingly negative. And you might say, well, that's just the millennial group getting to 35 through 44 and leaving large cities. But that's large metro. Typically, what would happen is that they would leave the city and they would stay within the metro. So Williamsburg and Brooklyn, and end up on Long Island, end up north of there, end up in New Jersey, God forbid. Just a normal New York jab, but that's not what we're seeing. What we're seeing is instead other metro areas, so your secondary and tertiary metros growing, and that is a result of not building in the suburbs or zoning out the people in New York City from the suburbs surrounding New York City. There wasn't enough available housing stock. And what that also did is kept people in the city longer, which means they're not leaving the existing housing and making it available for newcomers coming in to get that rental. And that's driving up prices. And this is another problem with zoning. It tends to be overly obsessed with just new building and does not look at existing housing and how that interacts. So we're just saying, hey, let's have more new housing. When I'm saying, look at the demographics, It's a quality of housing issue as well as a quantity. And we should do better planning around that, but also understand what the dynamic is with the other jurisdictions. Because what you see here with the other metros, were they moving to the city in the secondary and tertiary metros? No, they were not. They were moving to the suburbs because that's where they could find affordable housing. So they're taking their big city wages and they're moving to the suburbs of secondary and tertiary metros, and that's driving up the housing prices there. So the newcomers are seen as agents of gentrification because they're bringing much more earning power with them, along with it, and maybe the bank of mom and dad. Let's be real about that. And so the tenured residents who may have been living in the city and looking for their own home to grow a family can no longer afford to stay in the region, or they stay stuck in the rental. And so therefore that existing housing is no longer available to people who are, say, graduating from high school or college and would like to live in the city. So I want to end with, like, well, what do you do about it? And I mentioned going upscale in terms of the jurisdiction, but a big thing is having what I call regulatory arbitrage. You're stuck with these zoning ordinances. You're stuck with the comprehensive plan. But when you figure out the quality of housing that you want, you can create pathways. So normally we're blocking the development. We're saying, hey, let's figure out the demographics. Let's figure out the connections. And then let's incentivize. Let's say it's not going to take as long, or you're not stuck with the parking minimums that everyone else is, if you give us the quality of housing we want and the affordability that we want. Thank you.
All right. Hi. Again, I'm Hannah Sabo, and thank you. That was a lovely presentation. And I will be talking about zoning and existing neighborhoods and how to add density and add new development into those established neighborhoods, how to have like I said, additional housing in the back, maybe do additions, things like that to be able to increase the options for housing in your established neighborhoods. So again, I'm the zoning administrator for the city of Virginia Beach. I worked in the city of Hampton. I was the zoning administrator there. So I've been in local government for about 9 years, and I have my degree in architecture from Savannah College of Art and Design, Georgia? No. Yeah? No? All right. So working for the city of Hampton and Virginia Beach are both in Hampton Roads. Hampton is a much smaller city with a population of 137,000 compared to Virginia Beach's 457,000. Virginia Beach is significantly larger, so the city of Hampton, their density is much larger than it is in Virginia Beach. In Virginia Beach, you're also dealing with the resort area, so our home prices are going to be significant. You can see the median value housing unit, 287,000, and that number is not going to change by increasing density in the resort area. That's really not going to lower the cost of housing there. So, but if you're looking at the city of Hampton, increasing housing stock could help to keep those units at a reasonable price. So when we're talking about housing stock, we're looking at single-family dwellings. You also have ancillary single-family dwellings, so that's looking at having, your in-law suite, that kind of granny suite in the back, an additional dwelling unit. We're also looking at attached dwellings, so townhouses. That's another option. That's 2 or 3 units that are attached to one another. Typically with their own lot, so they would own the lot as well. You have duplex dwellings where it's one lot, but you would have 2 units in one building, and then the semi-detached dwellings. And so those would be, you would essentially have 2 single-family dwellings that share a common wall. And so these are all types of housing units that could be integrated into a existing single-family neighborhood through a change in the zoning. And I'll pause here and kind of look at zoning from a higher level, because I didn't see everyone's hands raised when we talked about zoning. The zoning ordinance is essentially the teeth to the community plan. The community plan is what the community and your council members, your board of supervisors decides what the goal is for that community, what the goal is for the city, looking into the future. 40 years from now, what do we want our city, our development, what do we want a city to look like? And then zoning then should react to that community plan and be the laws and ordinances to help that come to be. And so zoning is essentially what you can do on your property, what type of uses you can have there, including can you only have single-family dwellings? Can you have multifamily dwellings? Can you have duplexes, things like that? And how you can build them. So what your setbacks are, what your height requirements are, minimum dwelling sizes, parking requirements. So zoning is the tool to help your city get to their goal of the community plan. So I'm going to talk about, for the next couple of slides here, the pitfalls that one may fall into, a community may fall into, if they're looking to add density to established neighborhoods. So we're looking at lots of neighborhoods that are restricted to only single-family dwellings. And if you as a community want to say, we want to add more options to these established neighborhoods, we want to be able to have maybe, maybe you don't want to go and add a bunch of new apartment complexes. But if you want to go in and allow ancillary single-family dwellings, so smaller single-family dwellings, smaller units in the backyards, if you want to look at allowing duplexes, so conversion of existing single-family homes into a duplex, look at adding attached dwellings or townhomes, again, to integrate them into established neighborhoods. There are some other parts of the zoning ordinance that you'll need to update or to allow that to happen. So when you're looking at, we have here an example, this is from an example pulled out of the zoning ordinance in Virginia Beach, where we allow an ancillary dwelling unit or a secondary dwelling unit down at the oceanfront. And when you have that, you have to consider the fact that now you're going to have two dwelling units. You now have a dwelling unit in the back. You're going to have a driveway that gets to that unit in the back. So that's already, if you account for the additional house, now you have additional driveway. So if you have a restriction on lot coverage, you're going to have to allow for, the additional lot coverage that's going to come with that. You have to, of course, consider setbacks. You're adding an additional building onto that lot. So you need to make sure that your setbacks account for that. And then having surface materials, making sure that you have an ordinance that accounts for if you're having this additional drive area, maybe you're going to require pervious pavers. Maybe you're going to look at landscaping versus hardscaping. If you are having all this new additional pervious area, do you want to require landscaping versus just grass or turf? And I will note that here, this is from Virginia Beach, and what we have is an overlay. And so you essentially get a density bonus if you comply with a density bonus with that density bonus, you get to have reduced setbacks. You get to have these reduced parking, but you have to comply with our material standards. You have to build quality housing. So that's where we get that, those teeth there and that ability to say, we're going to allow you to have additional housing. We're going to allow you to encroach into these setbacks, but you have to provide quality housing. Another kind of pitfall here is the parking minimums. As I talked about, you're going to have increased density. Your zoning ordinance probably has a minimum parking requirement for each dwelling unit, 2-3 parking spaces. You're now going to have that doubled if you have an increased dwelling units. So consider that there's going to be increased lot coverage again if you're having those parking spaces on there. And decreased lot area for parking. That's just more space that you're going to have. Are you going to allow parking on lawns? Is that something that you want to allow in your city? Is that something that the neighborhoods are going to be okay with? And then increased street parking. That's always going to be a problem in neighborhoods. If you have increased density, people are going to complain about street parking. So consider those options. Consider your street widths and things like that for these types of options. And then dealing with existing established neighborhoods, you're going to look at lot area minimums. In a lot of these existing single-family neighborhoods, the minimum lot sizes are quite large. So if you're going into your zoning ordinance, look at reducing the minimum lot sizes. Look at a lot of your existing neighborhoods. In both the cities I've worked at, we had established neighborhoods that didn't meet the zoning code because they were built prior to the zoning ordinance, and those lot areas were much smaller than what the zoning ordinance requires. So look at your established neighborhoods and maybe consider that you could change the zoning ordinance to match what was already built, what people are currently living under. And maybe that is an acceptable lot minimum size to use for other parts of the city. Consider the option for flag lots. Some cities prohibit flag lots. Flag lots are when you have one house in the front and then a separate lot in the back, and there is just a small strip of land that gets access to that back property. So that's, again, another opportunity to add housing stock, to add dwelling units into these existing neighborhoods. And this is a photo from the city of Virginia Beach where we have a neighborhood where we have a great mix of different types of housing. There's single-family dwellings, and this is actually a semi-detached housing. So this is two houses that are attached in the middle. But if you're driving through the neighborhood, unless you're paying attention, you would never notice that you were driving past semi-attached housing, that you were driving past duplexes. And there are requirements, there are ways that you can design, or that these houses can be designed to be integrated and to look from the street like single-family dwellings. And you can do that through using that overlay, an opt-in overlay, where they get that density bonus, or they get those reduced setbacks, they get those reductions in the lot coverage requirements in order, if they build houses which maybe look like single-family dwellings or meet your material requirements. And of course, I couldn't talk about increased density in existing established neighborhoods without talking about the infrastructure that your city will have to consider with that. If you're going to be adding housing stock to existing neighborhoods, you have to consider schools. You have to consider, water and sewer, making sure that your city is prepared for the new housing stock, new development, new homes going in, or just, more people living in a neighborhood. Looking at floodplain management, there are areas in cities where it may not be reasonable to add housing stock. The city of Hampton, we have a lot of flooding, and there are neighborhoods that have severe flooding. That may not be a neighborhood that we would want to consider adding density, adding housing stock to, because that does flood. And so that may not be a long-range solution. So do consider, where these neighborhoods are and where they're sitting. And then, of course, stormwater. That's if you're adding a new impervious surface, you're adding, the new driveways, new houses. Consider the stormwater implications. You can have requirements for rain barrels, having rain gardens, things like that on site to help change to help mitigate the effects of those new impervious surfaces, so that you, as the city, are not having to take up that slack fully. And I think that's it. If you have any other questions, my contact information is there, and thank you.
Okay. All right. This is kind of random photograph for you all. I'm from Puerto Rico. And so maybe this image maybe you are zoned out listening about zoning for 2 hours and you wish you were on a beach. But I'm from Puerto Rico. That's why I put the slide up of the beach. I have lived in Richmond for 11 years. I came to the mainland for college, but I've been in Richmond for 11 years. And I really enjoyed working in the city, helping guide the redevelopment of the place. One of the things that we can't talk about zoning reform and changing zoning without talking about the future land use and without talking about transportation networks. Also other infrastructure, I'm not kind of discounting that, but I kind of build in where you can build is built into the future land use based on utilities and things like that and flooding. But you have to talk about all these things together. And some of the other panelists have already mentioned that, but you have to have a vision before you start doing some of the zoning reform, especially if you want to undertake some of the meatier issues. And that process of creating that future land use vision takes a long time. It involves thousands of people, which is what we did in Richmond. But you have to do it. You can't skip over it. So Richmond 300, A Guide for Growth, is the city's comprehensive master plan. It was awarded the Daniel Burnham Award for the Best Comprehensive Plan by the American Planning Association in 2021. And there's a bunch of people here who helped with it in some capacity. Can you raise your hand if you were involved at all in this process? And Joe, and yeah, there's a few of you. I see you guys back there. It was about 3 years or 2.5 years of public engagement, but really 3.5 years of work, because there was a year before you start public engagement where you're not you're not publicly facing, but there's a lot of work to do before you get ready. It establishes a citywide vision to create a beautiful, sustainable, and equitable city for the city of Richmond. and it's based off of these 3 maps. And one of them is nodes. And if you're a planner, a node is like the center of activity. It's like the crossroads. It's usually where your mixed use buildings are, where your density is. Our future land use map builds off of that, and then our connections maps. All of those 3 maps are described in detail at the beginning of the plan, and they're all referenced in these 5 topic areas where we have all the typical strategies and stuff that you see in a master plan. And that's high quality places, equitable transportation, diverse economy, inclusive housing, and thriving environment. So these 3 maps are really important. I'm going to focus on 2 of them because the nodes map are on there. So those dotted circles that you see around things, those are the nodes. And those are kind of discussed in the plan and carried through every single map that we have. And so one of the things to look at this map, those nodes are places where today there is really a lot of housing or job opportunities and amenities, or we think in the future there could be more. So it's kind of both. It's a mixture. Each node is a little bit different. So some of them are super established. If you've been to Richmond, Carytown is like a really nice established node. There's places to live, there's places to shop. It's connected to lots of different places. But other parts of the city, like the Greater Scotts Addition Diamond area right now, today is just a baseball stadium with parking. But in 20 years, it's going to be something way more awesome, the Diamond District. And so the future land use map, if you look at it a lot closer, you'll see that all of our mixed-use districts are concentrated near those nodes. So you don't really have any mixed-use districts outside of the nodes. So, some of the more intense ones. Some people, when we were developing this map, were like, there should be mixed-use districts everywhere, and like every single area should be mixed-use. I'm like, maybe in like 70 years. Like, we're not gonna all of a sudden transform suburban, like Windsor Farms, which is a really affluent neighborhood, into like a mixed-use district, or even like a suburban subdivision, like all of a sudden is going to become mixed use. That's okay. Like, we don't all have to be mixed use. But the idea is that we make these mixed use nodes and then we connect them. So that's the transportation piece. This is one of the 4 transportation maps in the plan. This one shows transit. And so we're really focusing on where we want our high speed, high frequency transit to go and having it connect those nodes. We also have our greenways, connect the nodes, trying to improve bridges and access to these places, also looking at those nodes. And thinking about how the neighborhoods, the people who live in all these different neighborhoods that are in between the nodes, how they're getting to those places. Because I lived part of my life in Boston, Massachusetts, in Newton, Massachusetts, rather. And in Newton, there was like all these centers. There's like Newton Highlands, Newton Upper Falls. Like, where are you from? I'm from Newton Upper Falls. And they all had these own little districts. And so oftentimes when people talk about where they're from, they don't necessarily say, I'm from like the subdivision necessarily. They might say like the intersection. And so we want to make those stronger, because if we make the nodes stronger, the neighborhoods follow. So like any master plan, there's 1,000 things and like really long, and nobody reads it all. Except for like nerdy planners. And so what we did is we identified 6 big moves to implement that master plan. So these are the 6 things that if we can work on those over the next 5 years, we have 3 more years to work on implementing these. If we can advance these in a really impactful way, we're going to be in a good place when we come to update it. So I highlighted rewrite the zoning ordinance. Our zoning ordinance was last comprehensively rewritten in 1972. We have done kind of little tweaks and changes and introduction of certain zoning districts, but that was the last time we did it comprehensively. All of the other things here really hinge on trying to have better zoning. So as we reimagine priority growth nodes, which are the places where we think the most growth will happen, we're looking at, we rezoned the property so that we could encourage the growth that we wanted to see. So this is just a slide about what my office is. I work, after the master plan was adopted, I was hired by the city, and we established this Office of Equitable Development. We focus on 4 things: city-initiated rezonings, helping redevelop city-owned land, doing more small area planning, because even after you've done your comp plan, you're never done planning, and then helping align the capital budget with the master plan. So a couple of rezoning efforts that we can touch on during Q&A that we've worked on. This one is completed. And if you were here last year at the conference, Kevin Vonk, the director of planning, spoke to this. So he led this effort, and it was basically to allow emergency, transitional, and supportive housing by right in these districts. So it's not everywhere in the city, but before this legislation passed, it wasn't by right in any of these districts. They all required special approvals. So prior to the change, you can see the zoning districts that allow the uses on the top, and everywhere it's orange, that means that it needed a special approval by Planning Commission in order. So it's not like basically everywhere, even if it was allowed, it had a special approval, which makes it hard to do. After the change, with some special kind of regulations attached, now it's more by right in all of those districts. One that's ongoing right now is eliminating parking minimums. We're looking at just eliminating it from all zoning districts. We'll still have parking lot requirements, so you can't build really terrible parking lots, but we won't be telling developers how many parking spots to build. Things that we're kind of thinking about that is it's in the context of the master plan that I showed you. We're working on building density and connecting places with greenways and transit. We're trying to improve our multimodal system, so it's not like we're just doing this in a vacuum. We couldn't have done this, eliminate parking minimums, without having done a plan first. It can help, eliminating parking minimums can help reduce costs for affordable housing developers and for small businesses that are trying to open up like a 1,000 square foot space and have to hunt for parking spots. This is an image of our first parking ordinance from like the 1940s or something. We did some focus groups about eliminating parking minimums, and people brought up all of the stuff. The focus groups, I'd never done this as a community engagement process, but it was actually really nice because people weren't shouting at you. They were like sitting around a table and having civil conversations. And it was just a very low stress way to kind of get some comments from people. Another one that we're working on right now is allowing accessory dwelling units by right. And similarly, so this little image shows how many people are in support of it from a meeting. So I think this one we have a lot of support for, but one of the things that I'm very aware of is that building an accessory dwelling unit is actually rather expensive. So it's not necessarily a really great way to provide affordable housing, but it at least is something, right? So like, let's just allow that to happen so we don't have to spend staff time approving them when they're gonna get approved anyway, and let people and set the regulations accordingly. Another one we're working on is amending our short-term rental regulations. This really impacts housing, as I'm sure all of you are aware, because it takes units off the market. And so one of the things we're actually thinking about now is most likely having some sort of proximity requirement, like you can't have one within 250 feet of another one, so you at least don't have a full block of like accessory of STRs, and that you also can't, we already have it that you can't be an LLC owner. So again, community concerns are probably what you guys have heard, you know, people thinking that they're great because it benefits, you know, them and it generates tax revenue, but then also understanding the affordable housing piece. And then on deck is rewriting the zoning ordinance. We have the funding for it. Have drafted our RFP, and we're going to be coming out with that soon to hire a consultant to help us with it. I put the walk score map to the side because, like, people more and more, even if you're a millennial moving out to the suburbs, like people want to be able to walk places and be in walkable urban environments, and the zoning ordinance really helps with that. And then also one of the big considerations that I think about as it relates to housing affordability is like it needs to be easier for people to get to work and amenities. So like that's why we can't think of like the housing thing, all zoning as like by itself as like a house, but like also how does the zoning help create housing units in places where we want housing units that are connected by other modes of transit so that people aren't like out really far away in like affordable housing, but like then they spend, 50% of their budget on transportation. So you kind of have to, that's why my final slide goes back to the zoning plus future land use vision plus transportation, because all of those things are tied, and like we cannot. As humans, we like really want to think about things as like single issues because that's like a little bit easier, but like you cannot do that in this space at all. So thank you very much.
Okay, home stretch. All right. To get started, I just wanted to share a little bit more about my background. Prior to my work at Form Coalition, I was working for a small firm in Portland, Oregon, and we did mostly mixed use and commercial infill and multifamily. So the image on the top left is a 6-unit townhouse for sale, affordable townhouse complex that we did on a single family lot. And then prior to that job, the image on the bottom is a project I worked on at a mid-sized firm in Oklahoma City. It was a 300-unit mixed-use apartment building, which is considered urban infill in Oklahoma City. And so that's a little bit about my background. And the image to the right is an example of some of the community engagement work we do at Form Coalition, which is more broadly focused on helping community builders build vibrant neighborhoods. So we do architecture, but we also do consulting and strategic planning with that as the main goal. As we know, as the other panelists have discussed, across the country, our zoning codes typically don't support the kind of density that people want. These vibrant neighborhoods with amenities and transportation and a variety of housing options. We also know that people want to live in walkable neighborhoods. There's a study from the National Realtors Association that says that 60% of people want walkable neighborhoods with a mix of houses and shops. APA did one that has similar numbers. 56% of millennials, 48% of boomers want those things. Also, the way that we live is changing. 18% of US households today are multi-generational, which is a 4-time increase from what it was 50 years ago. Let me back up. So, what do we do now with these outdated zoning codes before we get to beautiful upgrades like Hannah and Maritza described? I'm going to share 2 examples of specific situations where people kind of work around existing constraints to create density in neighborhoods. This first example is a story that is probably familiar to most Americans. This is Sycamore Grove Court, which is not its real name for reasons that will become apparent. It is 14 single-family homes on a cul-de-sac in a typical suburban neighborhood. 10 out of those 14 homes have been occupied by the same families for more than 20 years. So those families raised their children together in the early 2000s. At the peak, there were 50-something children living on this street. Those children all went through high school and got driver's licenses, and at some point there were, 4, 5, 6 cars per household on this street. And now most of the children have moved away. 7 out of these 14 homes now have additions or basement renovations that are apartments. Those apartments house elderly family members. They rent typically to teachers and nurses, other professionals, young families saving for their first homes. One of the homes, actually, the apartment is occupied by the original owners, and the next generation occupies the main house. The 2 houses shown in white also support multi-generational families, although they don't have apartments. Excuse me. I got some. Yeah, cotton mouth. This is a fairly familiar story. I think most of us probably know someone that lives in a neighborhood like this. Many of us grew up in a neighborhood like this. All of these apartments are not technically legal. They are what is a variation on the concept of heck of a wet bar, which is a concept that was coined by John Anderson, who is the executive director of the Incremental Development Alliance. And what it means is that you build the apartment and you don't put in a stove. And then you pass your inspection. And then maybe the resident brings a stove and they cook their food. You don't know. So this is a really, really common story, right? And it's a good example of like the way that our zoning laws don't support the way that people are actually living. Like, unless the neighbors have a problem, these things are getting approved all over the country. The contractors that do this work, like this is the bulk of their work. This other example is more of a typical multifamily infill situation. This is from some of the work I did on a team in Portland, Oregon. The neighborhood that you're looking at is Kearns, which is about 3/4 of a mile east of downtown Portland. It's multifamily, office, mixed-use commercial density, about 1 to 3 stories typically. And it's filled with amenities, shops, great schools, transportation. It's very desirable, and it's unattainable to most Portlanders, as many neighborhoods across the country like this are. So the goal of this project, we worked with a very impact-minded developer. The goal of this project was to provide below-market housing as much as possible. As much housing as possible, below market, for service professionals like teachers and nurses and firefighters who are commuting from the suburbs to support neighborhood services. And aside from some creative financing gymnastics, which this developer, this is part of the way that he works. So he's built a team of investors that are willing to take, lower returns than maybe a typical investor team. The other piece was that, we really had to get as many units as possible, do the construction as affordably as possible, and really make the units beautiful, because the way to make small housing, the way to make small area living work, it has to be beautiful, right? Or it's not dignified. And then we're worse off than where we started. So the way we did this was we took a look at two particular, and I should mention that zoning limited us to 3 stories. So that's kind of important for this story. We took a look at 2 provisions of the zoning code, or the building code. So this is why, working with a team of creative architects and developers, you can kind of work around some of the initial constraints that you perceive. The first is the definition of a mezzanine. So in the building code, a mezzanine does not count as an additional story. So it's counted with a story below it. So you can have a dwelling unit with 2 stories, and it really only counts as 1. And the other piece is the accessibility, right? Because when you do multifamily, you need accessible units. Well, because we were below 4 floors, we weren't required to have an elevator. And as long as we met the percentage requirements for accessible units, we didn't need accessible units on the upper floors. And if you don't have accessible floors, you don't need to provide an elevator. I know that's like very circuitous, but basically we didn't need an elevator, which saved us a bunch of money. We put big, beautiful, accessible units on the ground floor, and that met the requirement. So the result is that we got this 3-story building, which is actually 6. Beautiful units, double the number of units that we would have been able to put on this lot. And I think we did a pretty good job making them large and bright and beautiful. So I just wanted to share those 2 to kind of, we're headed towards this world where zoning's getting reformed, but we're not there yet. And so there are ways to think about delivering, well-designed, beautiful housing options within our existing fabric, if you can think creatively about it. Thanks.
I just want to thank our panelists. I mean, I can ask about 15 questions just in terms of what we have heard today. So this is the time for you all to become engaged in this process. And any questions, so there's a QR code up here and a link to submit your questions, and we will be quizzing our panelists on that. Let's give them another round of applause first for that. So I know we talked a little bit. I'm going to just kind of kick off while you all are having an opportunity to get the QR code and ask any questions that you all have. I want to kick it off. I think we talked a little bit about how we as planners, and I know in my office, when you're in the planning business, you're constantly looking at other plans, looking at other jurisdictions and MSAs to see what other areas are doing in this. And when Maritza mentioned the 1972 plan, I was like, gosh, that's so old, 1972. And then I remembered I was born in 1972. So if anyone remembers that progressive commercial where the guy is just printing off all the paper and he says, you don't have to print the internet. And I just remember year after year of looking at other plans and looking at other comp plans and other organizations and stuff, and you just printing in. But talk a little bit about what you have seen in other areas, any of you, any other areas, any other states, of helpful or informative ways that they have reformed zoning and things that you would like to see in Virginia.
Virginia is challenging because we are a Dillon rule state. So like she was talking, Eleanor was talking about inclusionary zoning in Fairfax, which we are not authorized to do in Richmond because of the General Assembly. Inclusionary zoning, if we had it statewide, fantastic. It's not going to solve everything because when you look at cities that do have it, it's not like all of a sudden they have tons of affordable housing. I think one thing that we're really looking at, and it's not a new thing, it's been happening for a while, but as we look at our zoning ordinances, form-based codes and like kind of trying to copy the pattern. So one of our planners right now is looking at all of our historic neighborhoods and trying to kind of develop a pattern book for them, going to what I think Hannah said about a lot of times our current old buildings like Churchill and the Fan and stuff like that, they don't meet the zoning ordinance. And so then people are coming for special use permits for building exactly what is next door. And so we're looking at doing that for our kind of older neighborhoods. It's like, what is the pattern book of this place and how do we translate that into zoning code for those communities specifically? So that's one thing.
So one of the things that Fairfax County is also doing well right now is repurposing of like parking lots. Hey, Michelle. So like we're looking at like old government centers that are just sitting there. For example, Fairfax County Government Center has a huge parking lot in an area of, I guess, considerable density, but they're going to be using that to develop a ton of units, which is huge. And in Fairfax County also, I think they're looking at what they call magnet housing. That's for like your professionals who are not making that much money, like the teachers and firefighters, and so it's 60% and below. And I think one of the other things that they're talking about is looking at the zoning to have alternate use. So similar to what they do with historic buildings, that sometimes there's a way that they can modify the zoning so you're able to use it. So they're looking at that for commercial space that may be sitting there, not being used. I know DC is doing some of that, looking into some of that. I looked at something from the Council of Governments, Metro Washington, and I think there's like 5,000 buildings in DC, like commercial buildings that are just sitting empty. And so they're looking at using those, which would be great because these buildings are just sitting there. I actually did love what you said about transportation. Thank you so much, because that's a huge piece that sometimes zones people out, even if you have the housing. So.
And I think also as we see more remote workers, we're going to really have to start looking at how do we rezone and repurpose some of the buildings. A lot of our organizations are just not seeing the staff in-house, and they're sitting here with a lot of commercial space that we really need to start considering when we look at other options for affordable housing. So transit and looking at that is going to be key, actually. So here's another question. Talk a little bit about social housing a little bit more, if any of you all can speak to that.
I can get on my soapbox and speak to that. So in places in Europe, they've been talking about this for a while, and also in Australia. And it's intentional because it's really a way of answering that question I asked in the beginning, affordable for home. Because the challenge is that when we usually talk about affordable housing, we are thinking about 50%, 60% and below AMI. And when we are having these new developments come in, they're actually also looking at as high as 80% AMI. And what that does is it locks out, it zones out a lot of people who cannot ever, even with a subsidy, they're not going to be able to access that type of housing. So social housing is used to describe those individuals, and they may be people with disabilities most of the time, who are on extremely low income, and usually fixed income, which you're looking at 30, 25% below AMI, and that's that band. So that term is used just to make the point that as we're developing these types of housing, that we don't forget that band, because otherwise they just get lost in the 50% and below AMI, but they can afford it. That's what that is.
Any other staff? Okay. All right, so our next question it's a long one. So while it's unavoidable that people will want to live in the suburbs, the form our suburbs have taken since the post-World War II boom and migration has been unsustainable, we all know, in the long term. What is your vision for better suburbs that are sustainable both environmentally and in terms of municipal finances?
Yeah, I think that your presentation was really lovely and had some great examples of how to build and how existing homes and those existing neighborhoods can be renovated and to add those additional dwelling units, additional housing into those existing neighborhoods. And I think that having, multi-generational living within those existing neighborhoods would be really wonderful, along with, of course, the transportation. As I talked about, as many of us talked about, when you have additional generations moving in, you have additional cars, additional transportation needs, you may not have the space for that. So having that existing transportation options is really helpful.
Okay. I want to add also that I think zoning in corner commercial into our existing suburbs would be hugely beneficial if you don't have to drive 20 minutes to get milk and eggs. That goes a long way. So.
Yeah. It's really hard because, at least I'll speak to the Richmond experience. Most of our suburbs are Henrico and Chesterfield. There are suburbs in Richmond too. And we don't control what the other localities do because, as you said, zoning is jurisdictional based. It's land use. I don't think it'll ever change in my lifetime, but land use is a very local thing, at least in Virginia. Maryland, it's a little different. But one of the things that I've been really pleased to see in the Richmond region there's two regional initiatives, and one of them is our Greater Richmond Transit Company now has board members from all three jurisdictions on it, Henrico, Chesterfield, and Richmond. That's brand new. We just got Henrico on within the last year. So now all of a sudden, they're all thinking about transit in a way that they didn't. And Henrico's a little bit further ahead than Chesterfield in terms of the urban form. But I think Chesterfield's slowly starting to think about it too, realizing that they don't want to continue sprawling out continuously. And Henrico admitted, I was on a panel with someone from Henrico, we have the bus rapid transit that actually ends in Henrico on both ends. And they were like, at one point, they didn't even want it, right? Even though they only had to put $450,000 in like of the whole $42 million budget. And so, yeah, and so like they didn't want it, and then now they're realizing how great it is, and now they want to extend it even further, like double the length out to Short Pump, and they're thinking about how to like grow around it. And so it's baby steps. I mean, it's the fact that 60% of people want to live in walkable urban areas, and so like the people have to change to follow that if they want to keep those dollars in their jurisdiction. But it's hard to do. It's hard to force very like kind of suburban counties to do urban things. They have to have strong leadership.
Just one more thing to add. I would like to see all of these neighborhoods have access to high-speed internet. I think that is very helpful for having, getting millennials and our working from home culture into those neighborhoods that may not have it, and that may be a barrier to people to realistically living in some of those places.
The second regional thing was a partnership for housing affordability, which is a regional partnership that has been organized by the homeowners, the Realtor Association, and that has really brought the affordability crisis to the minds of like county officials in a way that probably they weren't really thinking about it. And so that's also another big regional thing that I'm very excited about.
So I'm going to get on my geographer soapbox. If we could do one thing right now is to stop delineating between urban, suburban, and rural. They're not useful. And they're not useful in zoning. So you can have walkable suburban, you can have walkable rural, you can have urban environments in rural areas. You can have rural environments in urban areas. So a lot of the work, because we have new data sources, it seems like new ones every year, like cell phone data, credit card panels, and things like that. And so we're actually figuring out what's an urban area and what are the patterns, what are the demographics. And then we might say rural area, but there's no such thing as suburban. They're just land uses, right? And, so it doesn't help us to think about preserving rural or we want some sort of suburban uses and so forth. Those are made up. They don't really exist at all. They're just conventions and whatnot. And it's an antiquated way to think about it. It's a 1950s mindset. And we're 70 plus years beyond that. And when you look at the metropolitan sprawl, they're like, say, let's take Boston. So you mentioned Newton and you're getting out to places like Worcester. So all of these little mill towns that are cities, that are very walkable, that are actually booming populations. And so there was large migration to Massachusetts from Puerto Rico because of the hurricane. What was it, 2017? And most people didn't go to Boston. They went out to places such as Worcester. And you see that those are the fastest growing places in all of Massachusetts. Worcester, if you've been there, it's a city. And if you looked at a map and you've never been there, you'd be like, oh, that's in the suburbs. And it's anything but. So we can have cities in the suburbs, we can have suburbs in the cities and whatnot. But I think in terms of zoning, I would love to see that sort of lexicon gone. It doesn't help us.
You should have just dropped the mic at that point. Lunchtime. So this is something that kind of came up when you all were talking, is just education. The terminology that we use, the acronyms that we use in zoning and planning, and how do we educate? How do we really get in front of the people that this is new to them? It's huge, it's big, it's scary, and sometimes. But one of the questions, and I just want to just talk about educating people in terms of political will, our elected officials, as well as different departments. I am in the Hampton Roads area. Our organization is over 17 jurisdictions, cities, towns, and counties. And educating your your staff, educating developers. So the question was, how do we have a conversation between our affordable housing developers and municipalities? Any thoughts on how you all would look at crafting conversations when it comes to you're passionate about affordable housing development, you want to start those conversations with those municipalities? Give us your thoughts on how to kind of build or bridge that collaborative effort of having those conversations.
There's a book called Planning in Plain English. It's really small. I think it's published by the American Planning Association, and you should buy it. I don't get any fees, and I don't know the author. I think it all comes down to simplifying our communications. Zoning is really way too complicated, is one example. The housing, the like affordable housing lexicon, like I'm working on a choice neighborhood planning project for one of our public housing, and like I'm getting more into the HUD stuff, and I'm like, wow, this is like so incredibly complicated, and I have a master's degree. Like, that's crazy. So figuring out how to like really spend time with whatever it is you're working on and like hone the message to the absolute necessary words you need to be saying, so that then you can carry that to other people and start conversations, because it just does not. So that's kind of the first, is like really, really working on communications. There's many other things, but I'll give other people thoughts on how to collaborate. Oh. Are you going? Were you done? Yeah, I'm done.
Okay. I thought. I would add that in terms of starting conversations as everyday citizens, or those of us who have a little bit of knowledge, sharing with our neighbors, which is momentum starts on the neighborhood level, and then you kind of get agitated and you work up the chain, right? One way to really connect with people is, again, to illustrate the disconnect between, how people want to live and what zoning does about that. So, connect with people, make people think, as you're aging, do you want to live in a nursing home, or do you want other options? We all age if we're lucky, right? So that's like a universal connection point for folks to start thinking about, like, okay, well, where are these other options? Why don't they exist? If I'm young enough to work on this for a few decades and maybe things can be better by the time I need this, like, okay, let's get started now. And then, I think Eleanor mentioned the point of empathy about thinking about your kids. Are my kids going to be able to afford to buy a house where I live, right? That's another connection point. And then another piece is like kind of connecting to existing organizations that are doing this well. Like, for example, AARP has a really, really good messaging around livable communities, because they understand like this matters, urban design matters to their constituents. Healthcare organizations like Kaiser also do this really, really well, because they understand the impact of public health. So you can start to like seed these conversations in your neighbors, and then point to organizations with power and money in your community, and start to pull together a coalition, and then approach your officials.
Yeah, I think that from a housing provider perspective, we have to start by educating ourselves. So we can only be as good as advocate as we know, right? If we don't know what we don't know, sometimes that can be the problem. Or, as my grandmother used to say, a little learning can be a dangerous thing. Just enough to be dangerous, but not enough to be effective, right? So we need to educate ourselves. The other thing is about setting expectations and just being realistic, just in terms of what are the expectations that we're coming to the table with when we go talk to our legislators and people like that. And what are they expecting? A good example is, several years ago, I used to teach in the forensic psychology department for master's students, the Chicago School of Professional Psychology. And my first class was about setting expectations, because every single student thought they were going to graduate, work for the FBI, work for the CIA, or be like the people in Criminal Minds. And my first thing was like, well, no, you're not all going to be. Maybe one of you might. So setting those expectations so we can have reality-based conversations about what's possible, what's plausible, what's feasible, what's affordable, and what do all of the other stakeholders bring to the table, and how do they rank? It's all about priorities, right? It's, these people who make the decisions, they have a lot of people that are coming and knocking on the door saying, well, we want this, a lot of constituents. So it's being able to navigate that and recognize that you're not always going to get what you want, but sometimes just getting 1/10 of it is a step in the right direction, and then you just keep working on those partnerships. And the last thing I'll say is being able to explain to people what the return on investment is. They need to understand what difference it makes. So from a behavioral health perspective, we know that if you're looking for behavior change, whether it's you want to give up smoking, you want to lose weight, whatever it is, the new behavior has to have a higher reward than the behavior you're trying to kick. Otherwise, you might as well just keep doing whatever it is you're doing. So.
So we have a ton of questions, so we're going to try to get through everything. But if we don't, please grab one of our speakers and have those conversations, exchange your business cards so we can keep these conversations going. So the next question is relative to, we all know this when we talk about density. It's one of those taboo topics that a lot of jurisdictions don't want to address. But the idea that certain types of housing decrease value is by large a fallacy, yet we still operate as if that is true. The elephant in the room still is density. How would you advise we spread some of those ideas that were presented today to those people that still think there's some truth or validity in that?
I think that for talking about zoning, and it's a very personal topic for a lot of people, is it's their home, it's where they live, it's their business, and so keeping in mind that it can be very personal to them, and also maybe flipping the script and making it personal to them. So, if they have elderly parents, that, having the option to have that, additional housing area so their parents can age in place, so their parents can, move in with them, reminding them or having them think about if it's their kids that, maybe need a place to stay, they need to move back home with mom and dad, that it can be something that could be beneficial for them. And also reminding people that if you have the option for increased density, that doesn't mean that you have to do that. That doesn't mean that all of a sudden your single family neighborhood is going to have an apartment complex in every corner. That's not what that means. It is having the option for it. So reminding them of that.
I think one of the things people are afraid of is apartment buildings. And I think part of it is because most of the ones that are built today are crappy. And that's not necessarily the fault of the people that are building them. There are market forces at play. Construction's expensive. Sometimes when you get a project over the finish line, it's like with all of the blood and sweat and tears that you have and every last cent that you could scrounge together, and it wasn't the project that you envisioned. I don't know what the answer is, but I do think that we need to have a conversation about, design standards and what makes good design and ways that we can make apartment buildings better, because we need apartment buildings. And I think that's one of the things that scares people about them.
I was trying to look something up on my phone to get the right quote, and I found it. So there's something that I guess Enterprise put together called "You Don't Have to Live Here: Why Housing Messages Are Backfiring and 10 Things We Can Do About It." So you don't have to live here. Enterprise, you'll probably find it if you Google those things.
I think years ago,
Yeah.
Housing Forward Virginia, I think Vaughn was there as well from Jameson County. We had them come down, and it really it kind of opens your eyes in terms of how people really think.
Yeah.
But it was and Jonathan talks about this over and over. We had a conversation with the Hampton Roads Community Foundation last week, is messaging and how a lot of our housers, we use those warm and fuzzy, please don't have this warm family out in the streets. But unfortunately, people really don't want to hear that. So messaging is key to trying to address that. So if you all have not visited that website, thank you for sharing it. It's awesome in terms of refocusing how we have messaged what we want in those communities.
I'll just add one other simple thing that maybe we think it's like a dog kind of thing, but so we work with people with serious mental illnesses, and we know that mental illness is highly stigmatized, even though 1 out of, every 25 Americans either has it or will be diagnosed with it. So whichever room you're in, if you look around and there are 10 people, you do the math, you'll know somebody is in there that's dealing with it or is going to deal with it. So we constantly find ourselves having to debunk that myth, which is that people with, mental illnesses are violent, they're this, they're that, or homeless people are, all kinds of things. And the way we do it is to keep repeating the fact. I know that might seem like a duh kind of thing, but actually in psychology, that's how you stay assertive. No, I know this is what you want, but I'm sorry, this is all I can do, right? And you say it 100 times. No. So we just keep saying that without getting escalated ourselves, right? We just stick to it and we give people the facts and we give them examples of why what they're thinking is not true. And I think it's a very simple but ultimately effective approach.
And Eleanor, there was a quick question about, what would be one thing you would say help get permanent units built for those with severe service needs. So I think that probably speaks to some of the success you have seen is creating that message and continuing to have that out in the community. So.
Oh yeah, it's about being shameless in our advocacy. It's about acting like we're mama bears wherever we go. It's about pushing back against a lot of leasing communities and developments may have attorneys with deep pockets, and sometimes they come at you with really scary language that you don't understand. But being able to say, well, hold on a minute. Do you ask the same thing of all the other people that's in your community, or is it just directed at us? It's about having that information so you can speak with confidence and authority about what you're saying, and it's really not backing down and just, we're not fighting about it, we're just saying, no, this is the problem. No, this is a problem. No, we're not going to let you do that. No, these are people, and they have a right to live in a safe space like everybody else. So that really is what's got us. And going down to Richmond, I mean, we spend a lot of time. We don't lobby. We can't lobby as a nonprofit, but there's a lot of advocates. We also use the folks who are directly receiving these services and housing, so they tell their story, messaging. They're the most effective storytellers. They tell it better than we do, and we put them front and center.
Great. So we talked a little bit about the intersection of transit and health disparities. The next question is relative to schools, and that is a hot topic in our area. It really drives the real estate. It really drives where people want to live. I'm always the proponent of heal all of your schools and you won't have this problem. But we do see people that move to those better educational attainments. So to what extent should school capacity be considered when shifting to a inclusionary zone model?
I guess I take that to be like, if you have inclusionary zoning, how does that impact? I mean, I would say in Richmond, I'll speak to the Richmond example. Right now, there's a housing crunch, there's a school crunch on the south side, because that's where we have our large Latino, that's where the large Latino communities are, and that's mainly what's driving most of the growth. The other thing that's driving the growth is just the generational back and forth that happens between north and south. So the north side of Richmond has has a lot of older people who are retiring, dying, selling their houses. And so they don't have any kids. So those schools all have capacity. And probably in 10, 15 years, it'll flip. And then north side is going to have capacity again. So, I mean, part of it, when you're looking at a school system, is okay, can we take some of our school buildings and maybe close them and stabilize them while we're waiting for the population to come back? Maybe have temporary uses in them, maybe not sell the property. Because it will eventually come back. So that's just one thing, but I don't know about in the suburban areas where they have whole new areas where they have to build new schools, because I don't work in that environment. Sorry, not suburban, the
dense areas.
Yeah.
Those are the two things you typically run into. About, hey, I'd like to have more housing because it would make housing more inexpensive. And, first blowback, traffic, second blowback, crowded schools, right? So crowded roads, crowded schools. Crowded roads, ways to deal with that, they're, a different thing. But the crowded schools part of it, a lot of it is due to misperception and not actual demographic analysis. So a couple years ago, Massachusetts did a big study looking at, so you had, suburban boom, people, so outer ring suburbs, so places like Loudoun County, that you're undergoing, a surge in people under 18. And you're having households with a lot more people in them. And, so there's two dynamics in all of that. One is, like what's going on in Loudoun, you might have people going to one school for 10 years, and then all of a sudden you have to rezone, and that is a calamity. And so our process of dealing with that is very reactionary instead of proactive. So if, like the slide I showed, if we were a little bit more proactive in looking about what's coming down the pike and understanding where the migration is coming from to Loudoun County, can allow you to really plan where you put your schools better, but also where we put the schools and where we put our housing aren't always, dovetailed and considered. But the long and the short of it is what the study in Massachusetts revealed is that the anxiety about the schools being overcrowded did not really look at actual classroom capacity and how much slack was there. And really going around auditing it. They were just looking at big, broad numbers and assuming what it meant. And so the situation may not be as dire as thought. But I think the real issue here is we need to be more proactive about how we plan our housing and where we put our schools and what we do with them.
So the next question. Speaking of the Dillon rule, I want to hear a big gasp with that. Would any of you all be open to the state taking over control of zoning rules, perhaps allowing affordable housing by right? We can all leave now.
We can turn off the recording.
Yeah, I mean, I think conceptually, from like an academic standpoint, like having one entity be involved, help make those decisions, like you're like, yeah, that makes a lot of sense, because then they those boundaries which none of us see kind of disappear between the cities and the counties. But I would get very concerned in like all of that power being placed at a state level. So I guess I would be interested in seeing like how that would get shaped so that there is some sort of local influence or local decision making. Because like, I mean, one of the weird things about Virginia is that there aren't a lot of like big cities with big city problems. Like in New Jersey, there's like a ton, right? Even in Boston with Worcester and Boston, like there's more, but like Richmond, so I would be like, well, are they only focused on like more county issues and not really the city issues, because there aren't really that many cities? Or, the rural folks might be like, oh, they're spending all their time focused on like Northern Virginia, and like they're not even thinking about like, faraway counties. And so I think conceptually you're like, yeah, that would be so much better, but I don't know like how that could actually work. I don't know if anyone would like actually vote for it.
So this is like, go ahead.
Oh, yeah, I think going off of that, we had an example. We were dealing in Hampton, we were dealing with flooding, and had an idea of what we thought communities, how they wanted to handle flooding in their neighborhoods and in their communities. And there's a neighborhood of Fox Hill in Hampton. And when we went out and actually spoke to the members of that community, they did not want, they learned to live with the flooding. They did not want us to handle it in any kind of, any way by the city. They're good with the flooding. Their houses are raised, they have big trucks, and it's rural, and they are fine with that. And so I think that you lose that kind of we didn't learn. We learned that by going out and speaking with them and having small roundtable discussions. So I think if we're looking at it from the state level, you're going to lose a lot of that.
So, and this is a very creative question. So if you had 26 acres to build on, hypothetically, just fell out of the sky, 26 acres. What type of housing would you go for to get a single family community look, but have the most housing options available if possible? This is a Jeopardy question.
I would like do something like the Fan. So the Fan in Richmond is, a lot of the houses look like single family. Some of them are. Some of them have 3 families. Some of them have 2. Oh, there's a big apartment building. There's a corner commercial. That's what I would go for. And then alley loaded and then actually build garages so people use them. The Fan, people convert their garages into other things and then complain about parking. But so that's the Fan in Richmond is the most dense community in Richmond, which people don't even realize it because it's not that tall. It's just that a lot of people are jammed in. This sounds bad. A lot of people are just living near each other. And there's a lot of amenities. There's parks nearby. Well, not as many, but there are some parks in the area too.
And the homes are beautiful, so you can live in a smaller space and it's well lit, and you have a porch and you have street trees, and so I would add, green infrastructure. Make sure you plan out the trees and the public space, the green space, all those kind of amenities, because the perception of living in small spaces is changed when you have access to those kinds of shared amenities.
Sort of like a quasi-shared amenity in the Fan are the porches, because people hang out in their front porch and it's a whole community. So even though those are all privately owned, it almost acts like a park in some ways. That's where everyone's hanging out and spending time together. And yeah.
So just ordinance-wise, I would create a form-based code for those 26 acres, requiring that all of the buildings from the outside look like single-family dwellings or look like duplexes, but then interior to that, they could be developed in really whatever way that developer or that homeowner intended to. So if they want to go ahead and add, 3 kitchens, all with stoves, they could do that as long as from the outside it looked like a single-family dwelling.
So instead of what or how many, I would focus on for who. And that 26 acres, I donate to the Virginia Statewide Community Land Trust.
Really? My answer is actually simpler than that. I'm going to get you to come in there and help us hack the system. I'm going to get a really good, somebody who's good with design, green design. I'm going to get some of the people who are going to live there. They need to be part of that design, and then I wouldn't have to make the decision.
Awesome. So this question is for Jody. Going back to the multi-unit that you showed on your slide, what was the rent for that apartment as compared to the AMI in the area for Portland? And are any of them truly affordable to people who have extremely low incomes in your area?
So I'm going to be reaching back a little bit for general numbers, and I apologize. If you want to follow up with me afterwards for more specific numbers, I can find them. The target demographic was, I believe, in the 60 to 80% AMI range, so it's working professionals. They were small spaces, so generally probably earlier career teachers, nurses, folks without kids. It was a very specific, targeted project for this particular effort. This developer does some interesting stuff with other types of creative financing for other populations. And again, whoever you are, if you want to connect afterwards, I can connect you to some of those resources. Yes. So, yeah, we can talk. But yeah, I hope that answers.
So in terms of going back to that key word of educating and collaborative work, and I see it so many times of how we work siloed. We have our housers in government in one department, we have zoning in another, We have planning in another, and they never talk to each other, unfortunately. So talk a little bit about what zoning departments can do to inform their staff about affordable housing. How do we bridge that gap between those departments in those areas, especially?
Well, in Virginia Beach, I'm on our housing board, so that helps directly there. And then also having education for your staff, for your zoning reviewers, and I think that's also really important, as we talked about, for informing the community. So having them understand the whys behind the zoning code, any changes that come into place, the why behind the community plan, and making sure that your staff, those people who are on the ground level, who are customer facing, are understanding, again, the why. So they know why, they know the realities of having affordable housing. They know that, that it's not as scary as maybe the community is going to think it is. So sometimes you will have to fight those preconceived notions also with your staff, but that's an important thing to do. So training.
One way that we kind of did that with the creation of the city master plan was we established a internal technical team that started meeting right at the beginning and helped create all the existing conditions. And then that team went away once we started in the community process, and all of those people then joined our working groups, which had regular community members and subject matter expertise, like Jonathan was on one of them, Joe was on one of them. And then, so those city staff members kind of became part of the public engagement process, bringing their expertise at that level and listening to what everyone else was saying. And so that kind of helps because they, from all the different departments, were part of creating that plan. And then now, in my work in my office, it kind of like tries to stretch across all the different departments and like work with all of them to implement the plan, bridging the different silos.
In the city of Portland a few years ago, some of the affordable housing developers in town got together and kind of worked with the city to bring a list of the regulatory issues that they were facing trying to get their projects through the process, and all of the red tape that was really like costing them money and slowing down projects. And as a result, the city of Portland appointed a position. There's a liaison for affordable housing. So there's a person in the city planning department who follows those projects all the way through and is the first point of contact. And I think that's been a really successful development for helping to move things along.
I think the only thing I'd add is that I think Fairfax County actually does a good job of pulling all their different folks in. And the way they do it is through these committees that providers can also sit in on. So that, for example, when they come and they talk about the comp plan and changes to the comp plan, you have a range of different people that are involved. And then they close the loop in terms of whichever committee they're sitting on. They have to do a report. So they're kind of talking to each other. And then there's a final product that's shared and people have input. They can say, well, that's not really what we said, or that kind of thing. So that's really been helpful.
And we have only time for one more question. I see so many other rich questions and comments on here. And I see that this can kind of go on for almost a couple of more hours. So I really appreciate you all spending your time with us today and hanging in here before lunch. But I wanted to leave this final question for us to kind of wrap up our conversation. We said that density is the elephant in the room, but we know what density means to some people. It's a congregation of certain people. It's a congregation of displaced people that have been zoned out, for lack of a better word, in terms of that. So in terms of deconcentration of poverty, giving people opportunities to live where they want to live, and that's equitable for them. Speak a little bit more about equitable development. That's why we're here today. We know the handwriting's on the wall of why certain of these laws were enacted is to keep communities separated in most chances. And as we look to build and create zoning practices and plans, talk a little bit about what equitable housing means and equitable development in housing means to you all.
Okay, take a stab at that. So The Metro Washington Council of Governments looked at all of the factors that they call it the impediments to fair housing. And they came out with like 44 things on that list that has a lot of different things. Pricing, location, zoning laws was made the list. Okay. And so when we talk about equity, this is where I look at it. So sometimes people get derailed because then they go to equality. They're like, well, it's not fair. Da, da, da. And so I say equality is making sure we all have shoes, right? We can go outside, we all have shoes. Equity is about making sure we all get the right size shoes. If I'm a size 8, you give me a size 10 shoes, it's no use to me. I'm not going to use it. So in the development of housing, in order for it to be equitable, we have to look at, again, it's for whom? I think you said it just now. Who are we creating the housing for? Do we have enough data to inform that? In psychology, we say if you sit in primitive brain and you sit in the back here, you're not going to be able to access your executive functioning. So it's all, it's all anger, sadness, all the emotions, but you're not here where you can think, you can make judgment, good decision making. So we have to have these objective conversations that really look at what is the need, who are the people we're trying to reach, what are the impediments that are keeping them zoned out, what types of resources do we have to use, and how are we going to share those resources so that everybody gets the right size shoe. It may not be brand new shoes, but at least they have shoes they can walk around it, and they don't have to just leave it in the closet. So I think that's how we begin engaging in the process. And part of that is looking at how old these regulations are. We have regulations that were done 70, 80 years ago. I mean, things are changing so quickly. The demographics have changed. The way that people live has changed. The way that people interact has changed. Who we are as a people have changed. So we really have to go back and look at all of that. It's a gargantuan task, but it's not impossible.
Well said.
Can I say one example of how that happens on the ground in Richmond? With one example, the Diamond District, which I mentioned, 67 acres of land, currently a baseball stadium and a lot of parking. There we go, better. It's all city-owned land. We're a Dillon Rule state. There's a lot that we can't do, right? We know that. All of us know that. The city of Richmond has 24% poverty, so we do have people moving, and our tax revenue is increasing, but we have a lot of need. So we're not like DC and can be like $100 million to affordable housing. Like that's like way too much of our budget. Then we would not be doing other things that are very important. So we're looking at property that we own, and we own the 67 acres. It's really close to 2 major highways, highly desirable site for redevelopment. We're going to build a new baseball stadium for our minor league team, multi-family, hotel, office, a park, all of that. And we think about equitable development in a couple of ways. One, minority business inclusion. And I'm not just talking about construction jobs, which sometimes I kind of find offensive. Like only construction jobs? Like, yes, construction jobs. But how about like ownership in the development partnership? How about pad site developers, hotel developer, minority, like that are minority owned? So the team that has been selected has 45% of the ownership is minority owned. The hotel developer is minority owned. The for sale housing is minority owned. Like on and on, going down the list. Their team from architects and designers and like has lots of diversity in it. Thinking that like it's not just construction jobs, also construction jobs. And then the other part is housing. So we have said that some of the units have to be set aside for public housing residents with project-based vouchers. And so about 80 units of the whole total will end up being that. And then, of course, the regular affordable housing, up to 60%. We don't go to 80% because that's too close. Like that doesn't really help our people. So we say we need 60% AMI. So that's how we do it in one example, because we can't wait for the zoning laws to all change. We can't wait for the General Assembly to change the laws to make us to do things. So what can we do with what we have?
Excellent. And I know this was a lot of information in 2 hours, but we got there. Thanks again to this panelists. Let's just give them another hand. I think this was a great kickoff to the conference and to the other sessions that you all are going to enjoy over the next few days. And I'm going to turn this back over to Jonathan.
Thank you, Shanita. So before you go, I'll do a quick Columbo impression. One more thing. Obviously, this conversation can't end here today. I was just looking at all the questions. There's over 30 of them, so we'll do our best to maybe share this with our panel in a Google Doc or something. We've got all your contact information, so we'll make sure that gets out to you. A lot of really great, interesting questions that I think deserve answers from these folks and from other people. So the one more thing, the thing that I want to leave you with is that we've been talking about being zoned out today. Got a lot of problems, got a lot of challenges, and we're just feeling zoned out. Got a lot of people feeling zoned out. So we need to get zoned in. So this is what we're going to do next year. We're announcing a new education initiative to think about zoning at a regional level, foster regional conversations, convenings, talk about a lot of the things that the panel brought up today in terms of plain language education about zoning. How did it get started? What are the disparate impacts that we feel? The reasons why zoning came out in the first place 70, 80 years ago. A lot of unintentional, but also pretty intentional effects affecting low-income Virginians of color. There's a lot of baggage that we still need to sort out, but we need to do it in an effective way that doesn't shut people down. And we also need to focus on solutions. And so we talked a lot about problems, but also some solutions here today. And so we want this initiative to be solution-focused, at least at the end of the process. And so stay tuned for more details. We want to come to your community eventually. We're going to make an announcement later this week just to kick things off, but then we want to really dive into this next year. So if you want to talk to us more about this, you've seen things that work in the past or in other places about zoning, or you just want us to have a conversation in your community, we're happy to do it. We want to talk to you, so come find one of us and enjoy the rest of the conference. Thank you, everybody.
What's the little video game code thing?
Oh, I don't know.
I could do a whole talk on that.